I remember one day when my mother was planting an apple tree in my garden. This tree, the roots of the tree, was wrapped in a plastic bag. You know, when we buy a tree from the nursery, the roots are often wrapped in a plastic bag. While looking at my mother, a metaphor came to my mind. I saw myself growing up in this plastic tree, wrapped around the roots. It was in this plastic bag I had defined my identity and written my story. I looked at my mother and I thought, my parents, like millions of immigrants and people who move from one place to another place in their own country, are trees on move. They have left one garden and arrived to a new garden. However, many of them has this plastic bag around the roots. They have not removed the plastic bag to get rooted in new soil. In many ways, they are living in a transit. They are living in a country, physically living in Norway, but emotionally and mentally, they are still in the country they left. When I looked at my mother, I started to think about my childhood. I remember in my childhood, everybody was talking about the differences among cultures, people, and values. They had more focus on differences rather than similarities. Without thinking how this dividing people among us and them had a huge impact on their lives, how they define themselves, how they write their stories, how they raise up their children, and it has an impact on the society. Everybody was talking about values. Norwegians and the immigrants were talking about, for example, respect. But seen from my perspective, they were disrespecting each other's culture and values. And I started to ask myself, who am I? Am I an Indian girl or a Norwegian? And obviously the answer was always, I'm an Indian. I have Indian parents, I'm born in India, and I have my roots from India. And as an Indian girl, it was also natural for me to say yes to arranged marriage. And when I was 18, I was a married woman. But after a few years, things fell apart, and there was no trust in our relationship. But we continued to pretend as everything was all right. Then I started to ask myself, who is Loveleen? I started to listen to my inner voice. You know the voice which tells you that you are betraying yourself? I asked myself, how can I be true to myself? If I'm not true to myself, how can I be true to my sons and people today or in the future? I felt that I was living a life far away from my values and my true self. I started to think about my sons, and suddenly I realized that I was about to raise up my children in the same plastic bag. And then these thoughts gave me strength to take charge of my life. I decided to sit in the driver's seat and start a journey on an unknown road without any map. It took me 4 years to build up myself so I could handle the storm which will hit me when I would take the leap. And when I got divorced after 11 years marriage, everyone turned their back to me. I was alone with 2 sons. I knew that my parents were in a grieving process. They would be back in my life sooner or later. And after a few years, after few months or 1.5 years, they were back in my life. But the golden chance everybody else was giving me was just a unique gift. The Indians and the Norwegian society was giving me the freedom to define myself, to rewrite my story without any interruption. Now I had the freedom to write my story based on my values and just as I wanted it to be. So I started defining my story. I called it Project Loveleen, with main goals and smaller goals. And then again I asked myself, who is Loveleen? When you are not a part of the Indian society and you are not a part of the Norwegian society, who am I? Again, I had to reflect on my values and listen to my true self. The main goal I had in my life was to become a role model for my children and become a strong adult, a person they could trust. I wanted to teach my children, my sons, that they should focus on similarities rather than differences. I said to them that you have to look behind all the layers that separate people. You have to meet people in the universal core, and from there you start focusing on differences. Embrace the differences as a strength. The more I became true to myself, the more I became true to my values, the more people with same values appeared in my life from the most unexpected places. 5 years after I had taken charge of my life, I became leader of the National Parents Committee for Primary and Secondary School of Norway, appointed by the King. A parents' committee with more than 1 million members. My strength as a leader was that I had the competence to look for the similarities behind all the layers which make us different. I met every parent in the universal core. I had the competence to connect people. My life experience, my story, was the most important tool I had as a leader. Today I have a dream. I dream that every business leader, every teacher, every leader at any level, every politician focus on the similarities among us people. Try to connect people so we can embrace the differences. I believe in that with focusing on the similarities, we can reduce the conflict. And imagine what kind of ripple effect we can get if we focus on similarities and respect each other and embrace the differences as a strength. Thank you very much.